us, we can perhaps start. So good morning, everyone, and welcome in this second day of our workshop on the book Research Agenda on the gig economy and society. This second day promises as well very interesting speakers and topics to talk about. And we wanted to remind you that this session will also be recorded and we'll put it on YouTube in case you don't have any objections. So we can start with the first speaker. He's a professor from RMIT University in Melbourne, and his research topic actually intersect with my PhD research on the relation between casual work and platform work. So Professor Iain Campbell, you have the floor. You will introduce the paper Platform Work, Precariousness and Casualization.
Okay, thank you.
To your presentation.
Yeah, thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. This is a perspective from the sociology of work, and it's a sort of review of some of the literature on platform work. I'm particularly interested in the findings from the empirical studies, and indeed there's some very rich findings, and there's a staggering number of empirical studies. And I'm particularly interested, of course, in precariousness and the theme of casualisation. The chapter's a little bit of a look from outside, in the sense that I haven't done any empirical research myself within this field, but nevertheless it's a look from not very far away, in the sense that all my research has been in low-paid service sector labour markets, looking at precariousness and casualisation, restaurant workers, retail workers, agricultural workers, etc. So what I'm looking for, I guess, is the connections between the themes of precariousness and casualisation as they appear in the platform work literature, and then my own, the areas that I'm more familiar with myself. I'm just going to run through the sections of the paper in the hope of being able to pluck out arguments and points that are of interest to people as I go. There's four main sections. The first section is on diversity, and to some extent this is just setting the scene. It's an opportunity for me to run through the familiar typology of different forms of platform work. Online web-based work on the one hand, location-based platform work on the other, and then the various subdivisions within that. But I should say, and this kind of hints at the conclusion, is that there is a bit of a hidden agenda in that first section, in that what I'm trying to do is to disaggregate the concept of platform work, or at least set up the terms or the concepts for disaggregating platform work, because as I look at the literature, I'm a little bit sceptical about the term platform work. It seems to me it ascribes a false homogeneity to some very disparate forms of work, and it sets it apart from other forms of work in the mainstream of the employment structure. And that may be justified for some forms of platform work. Most forms of online web-based work are distinctive, they're novel. But if I look at location-based work, these are very familiar forms of work. They've acquired a few novel attributes as a result of platformisation, but nevertheless, they're instantly recognisable, intimately familiar forms of work. Care work, taxi services, food delivery, etc. The second and the third sections are on precariousness, and the second section looks a little bit more at precariousness at the level of the job itself, what we could call maybe job quality, if there's a somewhat separate overlapping literature. What I've done in that section is I've plucked out the familiar schema from Jerry Rogers from almost 30 years ago, I think, maybe even more, where he talks about 4 dimensions for discussing precariousness, and I've tried to sort of map that out against some of the literature. Now, the first two dimensions are pretty straightforward. There's the dimension of lack of regulatory protection. In other words, protection from both the labour regulation and from social protection. And then the second dimension is also pretty straightforward, I think. It's employment insecurity. And in both cases, I haven't spent any time at all really on this because I think it's pretty straightforward and clear that most forms of platform work are permeated with precariousness on both of those dimensions. I've spent a little bit more time on the last two dimensions, low earnings and control over work. Low earnings, again, you could say it's relatively straightforward. Of course, there's variance in earnings, but nevertheless, the main lesson of most of the empirical studies is that the earnings from platform work are very low. I've spent a bit of time on it because I think there's a quite important distinction that's there in the literature, and it's there, I think, also in the mainstream literature as well, is that we need to be able to talk, if we're talking about precariousness, of two aspects of low earnings. There's the question of the low payment rate, payment per task or per piece, or we could translate that into an hourly rate. But the other dimension, which corresponds more to the needs of the worker, is the lack of sufficient work. And that really is probably the heart of precariousness in much platform work and indeed much casualised work in the mainstream of the employment structure. The fourth dimension, lack of control over work. This is a little bit less straightforward, and of course it's the centre for a kind of intense and intriguing debate between, on the one hand, the firms who argue that they provide a large amount of autonomy and flexibility and freedom to the worker, and the critics who argue that a lot of that freedom and flexibility is notional or nominal, and that it's actually fairly constrained, often tightly constrained by controls administered through the platform itself, which render some of that freedom pretty, pretty nominal. And I've sort of run through a little bit from using the food delivery literature, a couple of the aspects of that, in particular those that relate to flexible scheduling, the freedom to choose when to work and the freedom to choose how much to work. And I won't sort of say anything about that, but I sort of conclude with a couple of points there that I think it's wrong to argue that therefore, because we can point to controls, and indeed we can, and I think the literature is very good in that respect, it doesn't mean that freedom is an illusion. And that's true in at least two respects. There's always that space for worker discretion, which is the basis for worker agency, either individual agency or collective agency. And there's also, I think, certain zones of flexibility or spheres of autonomy that are left in different ways within platform work. And I think here we start to get a bit of a hint of the significance of the division between location-based platform work and online web-based work. That much of the controls in the latter case are post hoc controls, the reviews and ratings on the part of the client, the business client. Whereas in the former case, we've got much tighter, much more comprehensive controls. Anyway, the point of that section is really that precariousness is widely disseminated throughout most dimensions of work in platform work. The third section looks at worker experiences, and this you can't, of course, leave any discussion of precariousness by just talking about the objective qualities of the job. We have to also sort of talk about how workers experience those qualities, keeping in mind that workers are situated at the intersection of a complex set of social relations outside the workplace, as well as the set of social relations within the workplace. And this is really a commonplace of the sociology of work. In the area that I'm most familiar with, there's a lengthy discussion of migrant workers and the complex social relations that are associated with the migratory process, the household relations back in the source country, the debt, the obligations to recruitment agents, the visa restrictions, the discriminatory practices in the host country, etc. There's something there that shapes people's experience of work and often amplifies that experience of precariousness at work. Now, I don't think this argument is handled all that well in the platform work literature, which is a little bit strange and surprising, because generally it's very easy to learn a lot from the platform literature. And I've spent most of that section trying to chase down an argument within the platform literature, which I think is a wrong argument, which tries to draw conclusions about precariousness from the fact that workers are situated in terms of complex social relations outside the workplace. And it's argued, I think, in this particular way that the social relations outside the workplace necessarily cushion the experience of precariousness at work. And the example there is that most workers who engage in platform work use it as a form of supplementary income and not as their main source of income. And it's been argued, I think, partly rightly, then drawing the wrong conclusion that this naturally affects the experience of work. I think the argument is partly right in that it does draw attention very well to these social relations, but nevertheless it's wrong in the sense that these social relations do not necessarily cushion the precariousness of the work. It may be true in some cases, but it's not necessarily true as a rule. I've discussed that a little bit by looking more closely at where are those alternative sources of income, what are they composed of, and then what happens if we look at things like gender relations in the household, or we look at migrant workers, or we look at, in particular, labour markets. And I think it's the labour market context which is crucial, because the experiences of labour markets are partly to do with there's something about labour markets that can broker precariousness at work and precariousness outside of work. And this is how low-paid service sector labour markets operate, that they degraded work depends on the existence of an overabundance of vulnerable workers. And the two go hand in hand even before you enter the workplace. And I've sort of butchered a little bit the argument there, and it's probably butchered a little bit in the paper, but nevertheless, that's, I guess, maybe some signals about what's in that section. And then the fourth section, we're trying to get back to the link between platform work and the trends in the mainstream of the employment structure. And I think what we say there is, or what I try to say there is that we've got some very rich findings from the literature on platform work, and they're incredibly powerful, but they're not all that unusual. Most of what I've discussed here has already been discussed. Pretty, flexible scheduling, low earnings, multiple job holding. All of this is a feature of sociology of work as it relates to low-paid service sector work in the mainstream of the economy. So there's clear similarities there, and I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. But I suppose what I'm trying to argue is that they're not just similarities. It's not just a case of parallels between two separate universes. What we're talking about also is real overlaps in practice. And I've sort of outlined 5 areas where I think that there's actual real overlaps between platform work and a bigger zone of casualised work elsewhere in the economy. Now, there's obviously no time to look at that, But let me just maybe pick out one of the areas of overlap, and that's at the level of labour market participation. That's, we say platform workers, and it's not quite clear what we mean, but often it's people who at any one point in time are engaged in platform work. Yeah, but we know, of course, that very few of those people are engaged steadily and exclusively in platform work. Instead, most, of course, mix their platform work with other forms of work, and often those are other forms of casualised work that are not part of the platform economy. So you've got this real overlap, and as well, at the labour market level, you've got people who move in and out of platform work. And this is, I think, as their circumstances change and as the labour markets shift. So there's this kind of labour market overlap, which I think is particularly important. Okay, if we look at the similarities and overlaps, let me just be quick here. The strongest connection, I think, is between certain forms of location-based work and certain forms of casualised work elsewhere in the employment structure. If we try and make one final point about research, the implications for research, I think there's a need. I think I'm taking out a point that I think was made by Simon Joyce, that we need to develop research that can differentiate platform work and integrate its parts, its components, into a comprehensive perspective on contemporary labour restructuring. So each of those 5 areas of overlap is an incredibly rich area for the development of, in this case, sociological research. I think I'll leave it there because time is running out and has run out. And thanks very much.
So thank you very much for the interesting presentation, Professor Campbell. Now we can go on with our second speaker, who is Dr. Natalie Sedacca. Here we'll make a shift from the relation between casual work and platform work to a specific sector of platform work, which is domestic work, a topic on which Natalie also defended her PhD. She's now a lecturer at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. And today she's going to present about domestic work and platform work. You have the floor, Natalie.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, Ilda, and thanks for inviting me. And also, I'm really sorry that I missed part of the first presentation. I had to come onto campus before this because I'm teaching straight after, and I just didn't quite manage to do it in time. I'm going to try and share a screen. Hopefully that will, I know some people had difficulty with that yesterday, but let me just see if it works.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. That was unsure for a minute. So I'm going to present, as Ilda said, on domestic work and the gig economy, and I'm going to talk through the outline of the chapter with these slides. The chapter is an early draft, and I think there are definitely already points that I want to expand and develop from having seen the other chapter drafts and the discussion today. I won't go through the definition of the gig economy, that would be quite familiar. Domestic work, for those not familiar, is sort of, we could define as or the ILO defines as work performed in and for a household or households, which is quite broad, but typically including cooking, cleaning, housework, care of children and the elderly. And I guess really important to stress that before we get into the discussion of the gig economy, domestic workers have faced widespread and systemic exclusion from labour law. Ruth touched on that yesterday in relation to early domestic workers, but that's very much still the case, that in many countries, including the UK, you have a lack of coverage of relevant legislation and those that are often not properly enforced. Also important to say that domestic work in the gig economy has significantly increased in recent years. So ILO figures are that there were about 28 platforms in 2010, went up to 224 in 2020. And gender's crucial here. So while women are overall less likely than men to work in the gig economy, where they do, they're more concentrated in cleaning and domestic work. And at the same time, there has been to date a relative lack of attention to this area compared with other sectors like driving and delivery. And I think Uma flagged that up in the discussion yesterday as well. That said, there are some recent and ongoing studies of domestic work in the gig economy, which I sort of run through in the chapter and draw on. They are particularly limited in the UK context, which is perhaps surprising. So I did try to get an idea by looking direct at the platforms that were providing this and sort of looking, I've listed some on this slide. So I looked at their websites, what they say themselves about working for them and them in general, and then kind of articles that you could find about them in employee reviews that were available on a job search site. There are only a handful of each, so it kind of just provides an initial snapshot. But in the chapter, I analyse themes and issues in domestic work in the gig economy based on those other studies from other jurisdictions, so including kind of US, Berlin in Germany, Australia, South Africa, and kind of tie them up with some initial observations based on these UK platforms, as well as considering an agenda for future research. So this is, I think, an overview of some challenges of domestic work in the gig economy, and what will kind of probably immediately be apparent. Some of these are very much common across the gig economy. So the last 2 points in particular, of course, very well known, although as I'll mention, there are specific points in collective bargaining that make it even more difficult in domestic work. The issues of kind of hypervisibility, surveillance, ratings, again, very common across the gig economy, but some specific issues that come up in domestic work. And then the kind of gender division of roles and the valuation of work is a particular issue for this feminized sector. So if I take those in a bit more detail, so domestic work generally takes place, it takes place behind closed doors in private homes, usually without provisions for labour inspection. So labour inspection is excluded in the UK and lots of countries. So there is a general lack of visibility and scrutiny in the sector. So in theory, providing domestic services through online platforms could be an advantage to workers by increasing the visibility, as it's no longer this kind of completely private transaction between two parties. In reality, though, that does not generally appear to have led to increased social value or benefits for those doing the work. So particularly because being on a platform doesn't necessarily mean the service user, so the person who's taking the cleaning services, etc., or the conditions they provide are subject to more scrutiny. So the scrutiny tends to be pretty one way. And yeah, so the platforms obviously provide these additional mechanisms for surveillance and discipline of workers. So visibility ends up operating as a means of control. Even before you get onto the question of ratings, etc., there's often an expectation for workers to put up a lot of information about themselves to make themselves attractive to potential customers on the platform. And what is, again, sort of specific about this, about the domestic work sector, is that this can really intersect with pre-existing suspicion against those that perform domestic work, who, of course, are often racialized and/or migrant women. So increased control is kind of driven in part by customer concerns, particularly in relation to childcare services, which, you know, not to say that that's not justified, that people have particular, you know, want to keep their children safe, but the idea that you kind of have to suspect the workers and protect yourself from them. And I think that that's quite an interesting overlap with the point that Ruth was speaking about yesterday on how crucial that reference from the former employer is, so that there's that kind of what the employers think is really quite decisive. So sort of linked to that as well is the next point on discipline and the role of ratings. So again, you know, domestic work outside the gig economy, also very heavy kind of disciplining mechanisms. So, you know, often a traditional employment relationship where the employer has a huge amount of control because of the unequal bargaining power, but also because the legislative framework, you know, fails to protect domestic workers. In the gig economy, you see this traditional kind of direct employer domination being superseded by the disciplining and monitoring of workers through the apps and platforms, including their systems of ratings or algorithms. So that's been talked about as a shift from dyadic to structural domination. So we see platform labour substituting for more direct and casual ways of obtaining domestic services. And as that happens, domestic workers are brought within the disciplinary scope of transnational corporations. So a move from servant labour to capitalist service labour. And the shift and the role of the ratings is, of course, a particular problem if the way the ratings are prepared or algorithms work isn't transparent or is discriminatory, for example, on racial or gendered grounds. And as you know, other papers also have spoken about, that's almost always the case. The market system also kind of tends to increase competition, so meaning workers have to self-brand and market themselves online. So if platforms blur distinctions between different levels of experience and specialism, workers are then pushed towards using extra, you know, perhaps payable features on the apps to stand out. And there's certainly some care workers that have, you know, made successful use of that. So, you know, building client networks and translating that into reputation and sustained income. But that does depend on being comfortable with the technology and self-branding, which not all workers will be. So the system tends to lead to more stratification and more concentration of work on those who have better ratings and availability. So the system of ratings and algorithmic management can, of course, cause particular unfairness when it's being used to determine whether a worker can remain on the platform. And so, yeah, look, I mean, at least based on the kind of UK system where you only have unfair dismissal remedies if you are classed as an employee, that's a real problem if, you know, you want to challenge a decision made on the platform to deactivate you or, you know, no longer give you work. You wouldn't have really a route to claim unfair dismissal. And then unless, you know, perhaps unless you are able to establish a case in discrimination using those more limited rights that might apply. And at the same time, if they lose work, then a safety net may be lacking. So there's a general lack of access to social security for many gig economy workers, but also domestic workers, whether or not in the gig economy, which in turn can make them more dependent on the platforms. So that's one of several impacts on domestic workers of these familiar issues around employment rights and status classification in the gig economy. And as with other sectors, there's this tendency to try and classify workers as like fully self-employed independent contractors, so therefore not entitled to even the lesser set of rights that we would associate with LIMBY worker status, the kind of intermediate status that we have. In some cases, they allow workers to set their own rates with no minimum, which does make it arguably more consistent with being genuinely self-employed, but it puts them in direct competition. It pushes new cleaners to charge very low rates, at worst below the minimum wage altogether, but in any event not high enough to kind of offset those costs of being self-employed, where you don't get sort of sick pay, holiday pay, etc. So what I bring out in the chapter is that kind of one-sidedness of the discourse of flexibility that's used to justify these conditions, because in effect that you have this whole narrative about flexibility, and that's how we justify not guaranteeing work, but they're often really expected to make themselves available in order to score higher ratings. So those who are trying to combine the role with caring and other responsibilities and don't have that great availability may well find themselves disadvantaged anyway. And the kind of, the literature to date really suggests that goal of facilitating flexible labour in the gig economy can normalise the ongoing exploitation of domestic workers and undermine efforts that are carrying on to improve rights within the sector more generally. So I then sort of look at gender division of roles, and again, make the point that the devaluation of domestic labour long predates the gig economy. We sort of very briefly look at it here, but it's a big topic, and that the difference, one of the differences is that whereas sort of traditional domestic workers where they live in tend to work for very long hours with low pay, in the gig economy a whole new set of problems arise, like being a lack of guaranteed hours alongside lack of waiting time, unpaid travel time, workers having to bear their travel costs. I guess, should probably add, thinking about the discussion yesterday, that of course that's not completely unique to the gig economy, because you've always had that sort of divide between live-in domestic workers, but live-out domestic workers. So those that don't live with their employers have always had that kind of, often, lots of different employers, perhaps not enough hours in total. So that it's not a completely new model to have that in the gig economy. But what's also interesting is that we see devaluation playing out on the platforms with this gendered bifurcation of roles and the differences in reward. So of course we know that the gig economy is generally, at least on location gig economy is generally not particularly well paid, but I think we've seen that there's some sort of stratification between it, and even compared with other roles, the more kind of feminized cleaning and childcare roles are often associated with lower pay. So I give an example from Handy, which talks about just £9 an hour, which is, it's barely above the minimum wage even for employed people, and also highlight this kind of occupational segregation by gender. So women are very overrepresented on cleaning platforms. There are some attempts to push back against this, but that often doesn't get very far. And seeing that these are generally, as I mentioned, ethnic minorities or international migrants, so we can see how domestic work in the gig economy continues a trend of exploiting their undervalued labour, where we don't have a rights framework. And then the final bit is really on collective bargaining and organisation. And so we have generally practical difficulties organising workers that aren't concentrated in a single workplace. That was mentioned yesterday in relation to crowd work as well. And with domestic workers, again, even in standard employment relationships, they face real difficulties that come from the isolated nature of the work. So they're often in a workplace of one. They may not have much awareness of unions or time to participate. There may be fears over migration status. And in the gig economy, we have, that those points about ratings and reviews can mean that workers are particularly scared of getting involved and then losing their jobs. So legal protections are even more necessary, but rather than implementing such protections, that there's still generally this exclusion of fully self-employed workers from collective bargaining rights, despite human rights provisions that make rights to freedom of association applicable to all. So the recent Deliveroo case in the Court of Appeal found that persons outside an employment relationship don't have the right to organise collectively, and that has been criticised. And I think later today there'll be more on that for its interpretation of human rights law. And, you know, it's likely that the union will seek permission to appeal, but it is tricky as it stands. But I do give a couple of examples of this. So one which is fairly well known, the 2018 agreement between the cleaning platform Hilfa and the 3F trade union in Denmark. And here they created a new category of worker, Super Hilfa, with employee status to run alongside the existing freelance arrangement. So the workers had a choice of whether to be classed in this way, and after 100 hours of work, they would be classed in this way unless they opted out. Others would remain self-employed and outside the agreement. So the employed options seem to have a positive effect on wages. You had the two separate options, but despite that, the Danish Competition and Consumer Authority targeted the arrangement. It found that they were both forms of Hilfas were undertaking, and the minimum rates created an unacceptable price floor. So a really strong example of the sort of self-employed status supposedly representing a bar to collective bargaining. And there's a lot of criticisms that can be made in terms of international law, particularly human rights, and whether there's a misapplication of EU law on undertakings as well. There were also additional challenges to that in terms of a lack of mandate from workers, with many not being unionised, and also just not very many workers involved. So it does highlight that, you know, the limits of regulation just being by agreement and the need for comprehensive sector-wide regulation. And I do then just briefly mention as well this new agreement in the US, which is a pilot agreement in 3 states with the Handy cleaning platform. And this has some quite important workers' rights provisions like negotiation, paid time off, guaranteed wage of $15 an hour, and health and disability insurance. But it's also quite promising that it's got some mechanisms for workers to make their voices heard that might overcome some of the difficulties seen in the Hilfa context. But again, doesn't detract from the need for more comprehensive regulation. So yeah, and in the conclusion, I set out the potential for future empirical research, possibly in the UK context, given how little there is today. I think there could be real difficulties with access, but I think it would be valuable to conduct interviews or surveys that would look at issues like working hours, rates of pay, and social security access, but also workers' views on flexibility, and is that experienced as a benefit? How do they experience rating systems and other forms of control? Are they transparent? Are they non-discriminatory? And the whole question of collective bargaining. But yeah, just to summarise, it's clear from the research to date that there is a real set of challenges from domestic work in the gig economy, and these challenges, they overlap in some ways and diverge in other from domestic workers in standard employment relationships, and likewise from workers in other sections of the gig economy. So compared to the long hours and high degree of employer control in more traditional forms of domestic work, in the gig economy, workers face a lack of security or guaranteed hours and vulnerability to disciplining by ratings and algorithms, alongside the low pay and lack of basic rights that can stem from being classified as self-employed. And in the domestic work sector of the gig economy, these problems are exacerbated by gendered devaluation of the work. Collective bargaining is constrained, and while the chapter presents 2 examples of collective organisation, one of these face serious challenges and another is still quite early days. So yeah, just reiterate really that there is this need for a broader regulatory framework that sets standards across the gig economy, but also that is sensitive to the specific challenges experienced by domestic workers that stem from the feminised work and the location of the work in the private sphere. So I'll stop there, and it'll be great to hear any comments.
So thank you very much, Natalie, for the very clear presentation. As we leave the questions for the general discussion afterwards, we can go on with our last speakers for this section. They are officers at the International Labour Organization, and they write about the topic gig economy in the Global South. Now I will give the floor to Rani, to Nora Goebel and Rishabh Tier, whose title of the paper is Flexibility and Autonomy, a Myth on Taxi Platforms, Comparison between Traditional and App-based Taxi Drivers in Developing Countries. You can have the floor.
Thanks, Ilda, and thanks, Valerio, Matthias, and Harry, also for inviting us to come and present a paper here and to contribute to the reader. I sort of had a carte blanche, actually, from Valerio, who said he would like to have a paper on Global South, but Global South is a huge region and has a number of issues across a number of platforms. So I was thinking, what would be more appropriate to actually get into this discussion on the platform work from a developing country perspective? And I think one of the reasons I decided to look at this whole issue of flexibility and autonomy was largely because of the reason that in much of the developing countries that we see, you have a huge informal economy that already exists, and most of the workers in that informal economy have this flexibility and autonomy in reality. But the whole issue surrounds that you do not have any benefits or proper working conditions around that. So it's very interesting for me to see, also to hear Natasha speaking, and also Iain earlier. And Iain, lovely to see you again and to hear you. I think the whole argument of flexibility and autonomy to workers, which is sold by the platforms in the advanced countries, is quite interesting, because that's not the kind of claim that they would like to make within a developing country context. And I think much of the venture capitalists, and including the World Bank and the IFC, who's trying to promote this kind of work in developing countries, their argument is largely that it is a step forward from informality, and there's a formalization process that is actually taking place. So I think this paper, what it tries to do is tries to place it within that context to understand what is happening to traditional and app-based taxi drivers in developing countries within that context. And the larger context, as I mentioned yesterday already, is that, you have governments in developing countries actually jumping onto the bandwagon of platform work, largely because of a problem in the labor market. And the larger labor market problem is not only the precarious informal economy workers, which continues to be persistent, but also the rising unemployment that they see within those economies. And I think in that sense, platform economy and the jobs that are being created here become an easy way to say that, well, we are generating employment. So, you are investing, they're heavily investing into digital infrastructure, providing all kinds of training to workers. And in the case of taxi drivers, we also see that government is actually joining hands with certain platform companies and providing loans to workers so that they can actually buy cars to provide these services. So we haven't seen such a comparison across countries from the developing world till now. So I thought that is one of the contributions that this paper actually makes. And the second that it tries to do is it systematically looks at various aspects of how work is performed in the taxi sector by the traditional taxi drivers and those by app-based taxi drivers, and challenges this whole notion of flexibility, autonomy, or control that is often talked about, and as very rightly mentioned, are the reasons why in any sort of protection of benefits are actually not provided to workers. So the way the paper, the chapters actually divided is we situate this entire reasoning behind why we are going about doing this work in a developing country context. and then tried to look at the literature around this entire area, which is quite rich. And we sort of summarized that, though quite a lot of it does come from the developed or advanced economies, that could be also to a very large extent situated within a developing country context. One thing that is very important to mention already is that when there is this entire issue around platform work, it's often, and especially even with the taxi, it's much more there within the online web-based platform work, but even within the taxi, what is argued is that this form of work is a supplementary income, that you have your main job elsewhere, and then you have your car, and you basically take your car and provide some rides, and this is not a very important source of income. And I think that's a point where there is a complete diversion between what you might see in much of the advanced economies and what you might see in developing economies. And this comes out very clearly in our analysis and some of the literature that is there within, which has come out within the developing countries. And I think this is very, very important for us to keep in mind. So for this work, we have actually used the ILO survey data, which has been used in the recent report that we published, where we went into very in-depth analysis, both qualitative and quantitative, across a range of countries in the Global South, looking at both the app-based and traditional, and that actually allows us to do such a kind of a comparative work. Because if you don't have this kind of a data, it's very difficult to place it and try to see, what the differences are. One thing that we often, we cannot do with this kind of a data is trying to see, especially when you're talking about earnings, which has been one of the crucial indicators and has come under quite a bit of criticism also from the employers, has been largely the impacts that are there with regards to what the workers earn, and that needs to be looked at it very carefully. Because when you do a comparison of this type between an app-based and traditional, one can do interesting control analysis and difference in different kind of functions to understand, okay, controlling for a number of other factors, how do workers actually fare? Now, you can't do such an analysis with the data we have because we try to capture both aspects within the same period of time. And I think that's something that needs to be carefully looked at and analyzed. But what we saw is that taxi sector is largely male-dominated. There are very few female workers who are actually engaged in it, and because of that, it's about 5% that we have seen, and it's dominated in certain countries like in Chile, Indonesia, that you see that there are more women. But because the sample size is too small, we do not really get into it. The second aspect, which is very interesting to see, is that if you start looking at the age distribution of these workers, there's a very substantial proportion of the workers who are in app-based workers who are very young, compared to traditional workers who are generally, above the age of around 35 years. And the other difference that you very clearly see is that in the traditional sector, most of the workers who are actually engaged are very low educated. While in the app-based sector, you find that almost about 20% of the workers are quite highly educated. And this speaks volumes about what's been happening within the labor markets in these countries and why this is also kind of an attractive a form of work for many of them to actually enter in. It's only after they have entered in and are there for a period of time that they realize what the challenges and repercussions are, but actually initially it is quite attractive for them for various reasons. And what motivates most of the workers to actually join this sector is largely because of lack of employment opportunities. And that is something that has been very clearly said for both the app-based and traditional, though to an extent, I think many of the new entrants into the app-based sector did argue that it is also because of a better pay that they have got into the sector compared to what they would have earned in other jobs or in the traditional sector. But that has to be again contextualized and looked at as to what this actually means. Now, what the paper does is it has a complete section on what does this whole flexibility and autonomy mean for the workers. And it also tries to go about looking at it by comparing the traditional labor market workers as well as those in platforms by looking at not only how the entry is done, but also with regard to how they fare later and what the repercussions are. Now, if you start looking at the registration per se, platforms, it's pretty easy. All you need is taxi licensing and you can get it. Whereas in the traditional labor market, they have to pay they have to get special permits and licenses. And in certain countries, like in Lebanon, getting a special permit is not only very expensive, but it also takes years before actually this is awarded. And it's often the city authorities that actually determine how much of these special permits are actually going to be, or licenses that are going to be actually given. The second, which is quite a contested debate, much more in the advanced economies than that in the developing countries, relates to that of employment status. I think part of the reason why there's not so much of an uptake there are two reasons behind it. One is that the lack of employment opportunities that are there in this market has led to many people to believe that anything is better than nothing. So many people have entered into it without really questioning any of this. And we've been asking this question also in our surveys. And the response has been that not many have objections to them being classified as self-employed. And part of it is also because in the traditional labor market, you have a very large majority of these taxi drivers being classified as self-employed. To me today, if I really do a comparison between the two groups, what is very interesting to see is that the self-employed in the traditional labor market probably has the flexibility, autonomy, and the control over work that we often talk about. Whereas this is something that is quite missing within the app-based platforms, also because of the way they get defined by the platform per se into the whole process, and the way the entire transactions actually are undertaken. The second thing which is quite interesting is in the traditional labor market, you do have a lot of taxi drivers who could be permanent or temporary, working for a taxi company or for other companies or for working for households. And there it's dependent upon the contractual arrangements that they have, that they are permanent or temporary. Now, the third difference that you see very clearly is in the determinations of fares or rates, where the taxi fares are determined by the app based on distance traveled, time the ride takes, the search pricing, and all of it. Whereas in the traditional labor market, this is quite a contested area. It has taken quite a few years for them to come up with determining what the taxi fares are in a particular local municipality, which is not only based on the travel time, but also based on the waiting time that many of these taxi drivers have to face, and also taking into consideration the weekly offs that they have. And there's a basic minimum fare, which has been introduced in certain platforms, but not systematically, but that in a sense gives a sort of an edge for many of the taxi drivers to have some sort of a benefit. So, even if they are self-employed, they know that they could get a decent level of earnings because of the way the taxi fares are regulated within the particular city or not. And I think this contextualization is again very important while we talk about the traditional labor market. Now, the access to rights, this is where the whole issue of the flexibility and control comes in, where if in the platform, everything is algorithmically determined based on the location of the worker and also based on a number of other factors like ratings and personal characteristics and the client reviews and the feedbacks that go in. While this is not the case in traditional labor market, where you can find a taxi driver getting the right largely from the street or the taxi companies or the taxi stands. So I think this is what differentiates. You are still a self-employed working for these two different markets, but the way you actually access work is very different. But what is very important to emphasize is, unlike what you see in advanced economies, the platforms have actually disrupted the local traditional taxis in many of the developing countries. And this has huge implications because many of the traditional taxis do not have much choice but to get onto the app or the platform because they need to survive and they need to continue their work. So what you see in the developing countries is a shift from traditional taxi to platforms, more out of necessity than because of choice often. And this contextualization is again quite important. Now, how do these workers fare? Now, what you will see very clearly, which is a bit disappointing at a level, is that, but it's not surprising also once you start looking at the reasons behind why such a trend is happening. Irrespective of the country you take, actually traditional taxi drivers earn less than that of app-based taxi drivers. Now, this has led many in the platform economy to argue that look, this is a very better off or situation for these workers, and this is why this has to be promoted. And we try to do a kind of analysis, statistical analysis, controlling for a range of characteristics to see, what is the difference that you see between the traditional as well as the app-based, and it ranges between 26% in Morocco and 86% in Ghana. Now, why do you see these differences? I think there are a number of reasons why you see these differences. And once you start looking at them carefully, I think you can start understanding why there are these huge differences and why it needs to be interpreted with a lot of caution. Now, most of the platforms, and here we have just listed 3 that operated in the countries that we were looking at. We tried to understand how the incentive and the bonus schemes that actually operated. Now, every platform basically chooses its own strategies to actually attract workers or drivers into the platform, but also depending upon the country and the cultural context, the strategies actually change. So if you're talking about Uber, you see very clearly that meeting targets is something very important for workers to get any sort of a bonus, but they also use in Kenya a kind of a hourly threshold, or in Ghana and Chile, a similar thing. While they used working in asocial hours in Lebanon, Chile, and Kenya. So it's quite interesting to see the different strategies that is adopted by the platforms to actually attract them. And this is a huge amount of money. For many of the workers, it is almost double the income that they would earn if they did not have these bonuses. So that's one of the reasons why you see why app-based drivers actually have high earnings. The second thing I'd like to point out is that almost all platforms, this is irrespective of the country we are talking about, they have been trying to attract new drivers by giving the drivers who had registered with them a substantial amount of money to actually get them. And this was phenomenal. In countries like India, workers were earning at one point of time almost $500 every 15 days. Now, this is a phenomenal amount of money that you're talking about for a taxi driver in India. And that is happening largely to build up your network effects and to get as many drivers as you can within the whole. And this also resulted in a huge shift from traditional taxi drivers moving to platform taxis and actually sort of creating a huge problem for the remaining taxi drivers that were there. The second thing that was being done is that platforms tried to also incentivize a lot of the clients by providing them subsidized rides. And all of this is being done largely because you have venture capital funds. And we have some figures from Uber also in our report and also in the chapter where we go about providing, saying that the amount of billions of dollars that are sunk in, while if you start looking at what the accumulated deficit is, it also runs in certain billions. So there's absolutely no profits that is done, happening. So as a result, what happens is that because of subsidies being given to the customers, nobody wants to go to a traditional driver. They all go to the app-based drivers. And this has resulted in decline in demand for many of the traditional taxi drivers. And this you can systematically see country after country, actually. And this also had a huge impact on the earnings of the traditional taxi drivers. Apart from that, what we also saw that the waiting time that the traditional taxi drivers had to wait was about 50 minutes compared to about 23 minutes that was there for the app-based drivers. Now, this doesn't mean that looking at the kind of earnings that you see, it doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory fine there too. There's been a lot of challenges that many of the app-based taxi drivers have also been facing, one of that related to the bonuses. The first issue that they raised is that meeting the targets became very difficult because of oversupply of labor. That is no surprise at all, and also because of the way the algorithm works, which goes about giving, if you have to meet 10 rights in a particular day to get your bonus, it gives the 7 rights, but the 8th, 9th, and 10th right, you just don't get it. So workers ended up, as a result, also working huge hours to actually try to get the bonuses, and they were super disappointed over a period of time that they did not get it. So the gamification process led to this huge increase in working hours. We found that workers working about 69 hours per week on these platforms. In some countries, like in India, taxi drivers were working 80 hours. Now, one can argue that this was something that was already present in traditional taxi driving. Yes, it might have been, but one could have used technology to actually control it and to ensure that one has sort of decent working hours and also decent incomes as a result of it. But what you see instead is prolongation of a day, high work intensity, and workers also had expressed a lot of safety concern and also a lot of stress as a result of it. And if we tried looking at what was the reasons why they were stressed, that they were facing stress, often it was about the working shifts being too long, insufficient number of rides, insufficient payments, or there was pressure to drive quickly, especially because of traffic congestions and long waiting periods. So all of this has actually led to, I don't know whether Iain will agree with me or not, but all of this does lead to some sort of further precaritization of the workers and losing of the autonomy and control that they have, because they are now at the mercy of the algorithm. And I think the literature does talk quite a bit about it, and this is very clear evidence that we do see for a whole range of developing countries that they are going through. Further, and the final point I'd like to say is that unlike the traditional taxi drivers who do not have to pay anything out of their earnings because they keep all the earnings to themselves, here a part of the earnings is paid as commission fees to the platforms, which is a good source of its own revenue for not doing really much. And it goes up to about 40% in many of the platforms. The final part of this paper actually looks at this whole algorithmic management practices and questions the whole flexibility and control that the workers have by looking at the whole rating systems that are no doubt very decisive, as we have seen in almost all the other platforms, but also as part of the disciplining process that is being introduced. And about 70% of the workers did say that the ratings were very important, not only for the amount of work, but also the type of task. About more than 50% of the workers did mention that if the ratings is not good, they do not get access to work or access to rights per se. And sometimes they do not get access to longer rides or in areas where they would earn better incomes. The second aspect that was quite interesting is that there's a lot of emphasis that we do see in the literature on ratings, But there's also something else that is happening that is equally important, and that's done through other mechanisms. Client review mechanism or review is one of them, but we also heard a lot of workers saying that when their accounts were deactivated or when they did not get access to work, it was largely because the clients called up the platforms and complained about them or gave them information that actually had negative repercussions and impact on them. So what you see is that there is some process of self-disciplining that is happening as a result of it, as a strategy also adopted by many of the platform workers to ensure that there's a sort of a regularity of work and income that they can actually get. So personality was one of the important things that they tried talking about how they have to be polite, friendly, humble, and to give very good customer service to them. Otherwise, they felt that they would not get good reviews, and if they don't get good reviews, they do not get any sort of a work. The second set of issues came up about to be sort of communicate to the clients about how hardworking and motivated that they are, in the form of not only expressions, but also being available online all the time, irrespective of whether they got a ride or not. And that was something they felt that it was super important. And there were also indications with regard to the kind of appearance that they have, which has huge implications on whether they will get any sort of a work or not. The second point that I'd like to raise is that there's this whole notion that you can accept or refuse rights. You have that flexibility. In reality, that does not exist. And this is country after country, what we have very clearly see is that cancellation of rights has repercussions, not only with regard to ratings being downgraded, but their accounts are being blocked from few days to permanently. And many of them get fewer rights if they actually cancel right. They might be canceling a right because of some personal emergency, but nobody, because the way the algorithm is set and the way the entire platform business model functions, there's no room or space for any of that to come in to explain as to why you might be canceling a particular right. And all of this, just too short to say that while one can argue about, well, these do provide some sort of a jobs, but I think the question is, what is the kind of job that you're being provided in the whole process, and whether this is worse off from the earlier self-employed in the informal economy that you actually had. And ratings below a particular threshold very clearly led to deactivation, and this was very clearly said in almost all the platforms across all the countries. Further, as very rightly said by Natasha also, the notion of flexibility and freedom is often challenged as the workers are monitored and disciplined on a regular basis. And this was happening in the taxi sector through digital tools, GPS, and often all the information that they had, even what they were doing during idle time, was being tracked by the platform, and there was a disciplining process by not giving them actually the rights that they should be getting if they were in a particular locality. Now, many of them have tried to contest this in courts. It's a very small proportion, but there is often no dispute resolution mechanism that exists, largely because platform is in one country, the workers are in another country, and the dispute resolution mechanism is completely in a third country. And this was something expressed often by the workers. Now, this would not be the case if you're talking about traditional taxi drivers, where you could have taken them to the court. Now, in this context, I would like to just mention one point, that in India, more than the deactivation, the pricing had taken up a bigger hold, and that was being contested in the courts by a taxi company and by individual taxi drivers. Now, this was first appealed to the competition authorities and the competition council. Now, repeatedly, it kept losing because the competition authorities very clearly said that, there is absolutely no violation that exists as far as the competition rules are concerned with regard to it. Now, this basically gets us to the question saying that for most workers in the developing countries, while the issue of employment status might not be coming out as an important issue. The issue of pricing is very important. And how does one actually address this particular problem given and the linkages between the competition law and labor law to get this actually moving? So I think I'll stop there by saying that, well, we also have a section where we look at what have the countries done, and much of what's been done in the developing countries largely relate to provide some form of provision of social protection and work injury benefits rather than anything else. And the extent to which the unionization is also quite limited, which also brings up quite a bit of challenges. I haven't really thought about the research agenda per se for this work, but something that I could develop in discussions with all of you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Uma, for your presentation. And we can now go right away to our discussion and open the floor for the questions that you have for our three presenters. Matthias, please.
Yes, thank you for those interesting presentations. I have a question for each of the presenters. For the first one of Professor Campbell, he mentioned the connection between migrant work and platform work. So I was wondering if he was incorporating that into his book chapter or what his views on this connection were. And then for Dr. Sedacca, I was wondering if you consider food delivery a form of domestic work. And then at last for the people, the ILO officers, for instance, in Belgium and New York, I think you could argue that transport law and those authorities, as well as the transportation companies, the original ones, have put up quite a bit of a struggle against platforms, especially more than the labor inspectorates in those countries. How has that been unfolding in the Global South? Like the tension between traditional companies and traditional transport authorities and those platforms coming in.
All right, thank you, Matthias. Perhaps we can collect a few more questions from Ricardo, for instance.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much for the presentations. All of them very, very interesting. I got some questions for each of the presentations. Some of them are kind of reflections too. The first one is for Iain. Your work, Iain, made me think a lot about something that is not just about your work, but it's about the whole, gig economy / platform economy issue, which is what is a standard employment relationship today. I think we're all more or less familiar with a standard employment relationship 30 years ago, but I wonder if that should be, a valid question for people doing research on platform economy, because I think we draw or we base our research based on something that may be outdated, and I always have this concern or question, right? Every time I'm actually doing research on that field too. And your work also made me think about this set of scholars criticizing researchers doing, research on platform work by saying that platform work is nothing but another version of, non-standard employment and all of that. And my question is, well, if that's true, then why are we interested on this? Why we don't just do research on precariousness in general or non-standard work in general? I was wondering if these two questions came across on your research, because I don't know, when you were presenting, I was just thinking about it, and I think these are important questions for the field. And Natalie, I really enjoyed your presentation too. I had some questions. The first one is about what you said about the shift from dyadic to structural market domination. I have an understanding of dyadic and structural market domination based on Sabil Rahman's book, Democracy Against Domination. I work a lot with these concepts, but I'm not really sure what you mean by this. If you can expand this a little bit, that'll be great. And my second question is, if you have considered actions of cleaners and people working in private spaces to subvert the platform. For example, Juliet Shaw has interesting work on how these sort of workers are subverting the platforms by making the first contact with the customers through the platform, and then just carry on with the business without the platform. And this might be an interesting strategy, I think, that maybe could be mentioned in your work. And the last thing is for you, Natalie, some sort of recommendation. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Flex, Focus on Labor Exploitation. I used to work with them and interview Latin American workers in the UK working in the cleaning sector. And I think there's a lot of interesting material in there for your contribution. And my last comment is for Uma, Nora, and Rishabh. Thank you so much for raising this point. I'm from Chile, so I was just very, very happy to see that there's some focus on the global south. I also think this is an extremely important contribution because platform work and gig work has a lot of different implications in different parts of the world. For example, just to give you an example, a friend of mine in Colombia was so happy that Uber came because she felt much, much safer taking an Uber than taking a taxi, because in Colombia, according to her, people are kidnapped if you take a taxi. And Uber solved this problem because there's an identity, right? And so and there's a GPS system behind Uber and all of that. So this sort of impacts may be positive, right? And actually change our perception of platform gig work. And also about the corruption, the global south sometimes is subject to a much higher threshold of corruption, and obtaining permits is a really, really big issue, like you mentioned. For example, permits for using the car in the city and so on. But, and this is a big but, I'm unsure whether a global south approach will be adequate, and this is a question, not a critique. Do you think that framing your work as in the global south will actually bring all the nuances that each region and each country in the global south may bring? And I finish with this example. In Chile, there's a very minimum tradition of trade unionism because of Pinochet, and he destroyed our understanding of collective labor rights. But in Argentina, there's a very, very strong tradition of labor unionism. So the effects of the operation of platforms in general may be different because of the pressure of workers. What do you think about this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. As we are running a bit of time for the answers as well, maybe we can have also Harry's question and we go on with the answers to these questions.
Really simple, really simple. Thank you so much for your presentations. They were all amazing. Just a simple question for Natalie. I'm just wondering whether the pilot agreement in the US, the one that you referred, applies to all workers regardless the status, so that's also independent contractors working as domestic workers, or some provisions apply just on employee domestic workers. Thank you.
So thank you very much for these questions. Now we can start answering them. If Professor Campbell wants to start first, as his presentation was first.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the questions or comments. I think they're sort of reminders of things to keep in mind. Matthias very kindly asked about migrant work. Yeah, I think this is exceptionally important, especially in the Australian context, when you look at food delivery workers and the Uber taxi services. They're almost exclusively dominated by temporary migrant workers. It's very hard to understand what's happening there in those industries unless you can incorporate some kind of discussion of migrant work, and hopefully within the limits of the chapter I'll have something to say about that. Ricardo, I'm a bit worried that made a couple of points, and I'm a bit worried that maybe I've given the wrong impression. You did ask about the standard employment relationship. I don't mention it at all, not that I think it's unimportant. Obviously, it's very important as a regulatory pivot in the industrialised high-income countries. I suppose what I'm trying to stress is that in those countries there is a zone of casualised work which can get skipped over if we sort of try and counterpose, on the one hand, the standard employment relationship, and on the other hand, the new world of platform work. Somehow that we have to connect up platform work with what is a long-standing and rapidly growing zone of casualised work. Now, when we get to regulatory solutions, we might want to look again at what that means and what the standard employment relationship would mean, but I don't have anything in this chapter that would jump into that question. And then I'm a bit worried that you're misunderstanding my argument about, in your second point, that I'm just arguing that platform work is just another form of casualised work, so why bother to talk about it under a... I think it is. I think what I'm advocating, I guess, is that kind of differentiation of platform work. And in a sense, what Uma was presenting is something that I'd fully support, an industry-based study which can compare carefully the dynamics within the platform sector and the dynamics within a sort of traditional sector. And it might very well be that we see some distinctive features in platform work, which I'm sure we will, but we need to have it in that industry context and with a nuanced comparison of the real alternatives that are available in that particular labour market. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Natalie, would you like to answer to your questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for the questions. So on whether I consider food delivery a form of domestic work, it's a really interesting question. Of course, if we went back to the ILO definition and said work performed by for or in a household, yeah, it is, and so are a hell of a lot of things, you could say. But I think we need to kind of, maybe not take it so literally as anything that relates to helping out the household. I'd say it in a way it is a form of socially reproductive labour, in that it's contributing to people's nutrition, and therefore it has that role. But do we want to sort of lump that in with domestic work? I don't think it would be particularly helpful, because the whole problem of domestic work it relates to how it takes place overwhelmingly by women. It takes place in the private sphere. It's outside accountability. It's outside control. It's devalued for that reason. And so, I think it would not be. And there's been already a lot more attention, as has been mentioned, on things like Deliveroo. Now, of course, Deliveroo drivers are undervalued in a different way. but I don't necessarily think that discussing them under the rubric of domestic work would be that helpful. Ricardo, some really interesting suggestions. So I haven't come across those. But in terms of what I mean, so there's dyadic to structural domination. So that's not my term. I cite that. It's from Frances Flanagan in her work on the domestic work in the gig economy. So what she's saying there is that dyadic, so two-way domination, a traditional domestic worker employment relationship, you're dominated by your employer, so that you're subject to the whims of that individual employer. They decide to give you a really horrible, difficult job and make your life difficult. If not, you don't have much you can do about that. And what she's saying is that this sort of two-way relationship is replaced by the broader market as the primary method of disciplining workers with these kind of rules that lack transparency and that aren't open to contestation. Of course, we could say, there's always been domestic workers that have more than one employer, so it's not a sort of completely straightforward model. But I think it is quite a helpful idea. In terms of cleaners and people working in private spaces, subverting platforms, I haven't come across that, but I think that would be really interesting. And I think because as well, those kind of people who can't always do a traditional strike, the fact that they have alternative forms of mobilizing is really important. And I'm very familiar with Flex. I hadn't noticed that they particularly worked on platform labour though, so I can double check. I normally do read their stuff as it comes out, and it didn't necessarily seem to me to have been on platforms, but on gig economy. But I will double check that. And then finally, so on the pilot agreement in the US, so I guess I skipped over it quite quickly, so I maybe didn't explain it that well. It's not a general agreement for workers. It's just with one specific platform, Handy. So they have the model that they have. There's relatively limited information about it that I'm going on. It's really just some stuff from the union and some sort of shortish articles. But what they say is that it sets a floor rather than a ceiling, and thus does not lock workers into second-class employment status. So I guess that the workers involved are, to be honest, I'm not that familiar with how this distinction works in the US anyway, but I'm guessing that they're not necessarily considered as full employees as it stands, but in making the pilot agreement, they haven't sort of accepted that as a long-term feature of their status.
All right, thank you. Uma, would you like to answer your questions?
Yes, Ilda, thanks a lot. Just in a lighter vein, Matthias, I do have a name, Uma. Don't call me research officers, please. I think, if I understand your question, what you're trying to ask is that whether there has been any sort of a tension that exists between traditional companies and platform companies. Very clearly, I think India was a perfect case for that, where because of the pricing issue, you had Meru, which is a radio taxi company, and also many of the independent or self-employed traditional taxi drivers. Actually, they filed a case against Uber as well as Ola to the competition authorities. That was the Competition Commission of India, and then when it was rejected, it was later taken up to the Competition Appellate Tribunal. They lost the case, unfortunately, this July, because the competition authorities actually voted towards saying that there was no anti-competitive thing that they saw in that entire case. But that's the whole point that I bring about, saying, given India might not be the only case, probably in other jurisdictions is very different, the uncertainty and the complexity that actually exists with many of this, when you do bring it to the courts, I think that becomes a big issue as to, you know, if the courts do not take it, it goes to the competition authority. How do you actually go about handling it? And that's where, according to me, in this particular issue, where a price of a right is the earnings of the worker, I think it opens up the whole issue around also labor law as well as competition law. And I think this is something that needs to be looked at. Having said that, there's one thing that I'd like to highlight is this is the only one that I've seen, and that was in India last year, where the motor vehicle aggregators, that was part of the transport company, actually came out with a guideline with regard to certain specifications as to, you know, what is required and what needs to be respected. Now, it's a larger, bigger question, the extent to which it's being implemented and being followed. But I think this is something that we need to look at as we move forward. Ricardo, to your question, I think the whole framing of the work from the developing country context, I think that has to be done much more a bit more nuanced. I wouldn't pick up the whole issue of safety concerns and safety issues and obtaining permits as one of the reasons to look at this entire issue. I think for me, the issues are far bigger than that. I think the initial cases, if you do remember, in India with Uber, as well as with Didi in China, there were certain rape cases that came about. And I think the whole idea of identity checks came as a result of that. There were no identity checks before that. So I think this needs to be, again, put in a context, because you could have that. You also have private companies where you can be very safe and you don't have to worry about it. So, you know, that's not necessarily the reason around going it, though we do hear consumers from developing countries talking about certain safety concerns that they do have. But, you know, the idea would be then, how can you bring about these mechanisms even within a traditional taxi driving system and ensure that kind of a safety is there, rather than saying this is what is the model. For me, the more important point would be how the platform business model further precaritizes many of these workers who are already in the informal worker. I think that's the take I'd like to take, and that's what one is trying to say, saying that this is not a step towards formalization as they normally promulgate and propagate, but it is much more precaritizing these workers. And I think within that context, it's very important, and that's where institutions come into play very clearly, because if you do have certain institutions in certain countries, as you say in Argentina, it's very difficult then to come in and then sell this kind of a model, right? Compared to other countries where you can easily sell it, because governments are also desperate to actually promote this kind of work, because it takes the responsibilities off from them, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. And as we are running out of time, we don't have, unfortunately, more time for other questions, as people need to take their well-deserved break. So we can have a break until 11, and we'll see you all at 11. Thank you so much to everyone for the very interesting presentations.